The Country of the Blind is a short story by English writer H.G. Wells. It was first published in the April 1904 issue of the Strand magazine and included in a 1911 collection of Wells's short stories, The Country of the Blind and Other Stories. It is one of Wells's best-known short stories, and features prominently in literature dealing with blindness. Herbert George Wells, 1-2, the 21st of September 1866 to the 13th of August 1946, was an English writer. Prolific in many genres, he wrote more than 50 novels and dozens of short stories. His nonfiction output included works of social commentary, politics, history, popular science, satire, biography and autobiography. Wells is now best remembered for his science fiction novels and has been called the father of science fiction. In addition to his fame as a writer, he was prominent in his lifetime as a forward-looking, even prophetic social critic who devoted his literary talents to the development of a progressive vision on a global scale. A futurist, he wrote a number of utopian works and foresaw the advent of aircraft, tanks, space travel, nuclear weapons, satellite television and something resembling the World Wide Web. 5. His science fiction imagined time travel, alien invasion, invisibility, and biological engineering before these subjects were common in the genre. Brian Aldiss referred to Wells as the Shakespeare of science fiction, while Charles Fort called him a wild talent. 6. 7. Wells rendered his works convincing by instilling commonplace detail alongside a single extraordinary assumption per work dubbed Wells's Law, leading Joseph Conrad to hail him in 1898 with, "O realist of the fantastic." 8. His most notable science fiction works include The Time Machine 1895, which was his first novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau 1896, The Invisible Man 1897, The War of the Worlds 1898, the military science fiction The War in the Air 1907, and the dystopian When the Sleeper Wakes 1910. Novels of social realism such as Kip's 1905 and The History of Mr. Polly 1910, which describe lower middle-class English life, led to the suggestion that he was a worthy successor to Charles Dickens. 9. But Wells described a range of social strata and even attempted, in Tono Bungee 1909, a diagnosis of English society as a whole. Wells was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times. 10. Wells's earliest specialized training was in biology, and his thinking on ethical matters took place in a Darwinian context. 11. He was also an outspoken socialist from a young age, often but not always, as at the beginning of the First World War, sympathizing with pacifist views. 12. 13. In his later years, he wrote less fiction and more works expounding his political and social views, sometimes giving his profession as that of journalist. 14. Wells was a diabetic and co-founded the charity the Diabetic Association, known today as Diabetes UK, in 1934. 15. Wells later revised the story, with the expanded version first published by an English private printer, Golden Cockerel Press, in 1939. Summary. While attempting to climb the unconquered crest of Periscotopedal, a fictitious mountain in Ecuador, a mountaineer named Nunez slips and falls down the far side of the mountain. At the end of his descent, down a snow slope in the mountain's shadow, he finds a valley, cut off from the rest of the world on all sides by steep precipices. Unknown to Nunez, he has discovered the fabled Country of the Blind. The valley had been a haven for settlers fleeing the tyranny of Spanish rulers, until an earthquake reshaped the surrounding mountains, cutting the valley off forever from future explorers. The isolated community prospered over the years, despite a disease that struck them early on, rendering all newborns blind. As the blindness slowly spread over many generations, the people's remaining senses sharpened, and by the time the last sighted villager had died, the community had fully adapted to life without sight. Nunez descends into the valley and finds an unusual village with windowless houses and a network of paths, all bordered by curbs. Upon discovering that everyone is blind, Nunez begins reciting to himself the proverb, "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." He realizes that he can teach and rule them, but the villagers have no concept of sight, and do not understand his attempts to explain this fifth sense to them. Frustrated, Nunez becomes angry, but the villagers calm him, and he reluctantly submits to their way of life, because returning to the outside world seems impossible. Nunez is assigned to work for a villager named Jacob. He becomes attracted to Jacob's youngest daughter, Medina-sarate. Nunez and Medina-sarate soon fall in love, and having won her confidence, Nunez slowly starts trying to explain sight to her. Medina-sarate, however, simply dismisses it as his imagination. When Nunez asks for her hand in marriage, he is turned down by the village elders on account of his unstable obsession with sight. The village doctor suggests that Nunez's eyes be removed, claiming that they are diseased and are greatly distended, and because of this, his brain is in a state of constant irritation and distraction. Nunez reluctantly consents to the operation because of his love for Medina-sarate. However, at sunrise on the day of the operation, while all the villagers are asleep, Nunez, the failed king of the blind, sets off for the mountains without provisions or equipment, hoping to find a passage to the outside world and escape the valley. In the original story, Nunez climbs high into the surrounding mountains until night falls, and he rests, weak with cuts and bruises, but happy that he has escaped the valley. His fate is not revealed. In the revised and expanded 1939 version of the story, Nunez sees from a distance that there is about to be a rock slide. He attempts to warn the villagers, but again they scoff at his imagined sight. He flees the valley during the slide, taking Medina-sarate with him. 7. Nunez, a mountaineer from Bogotá, Colombia. Jacob Nunez is master. Medina-sarate, the youngest daughter of Jacob. By Dr. Oliver Torrell, Loughborough University. The Country of the Blind is one of H.G. Wells's finest short stories, published in the Strand magazine in 1904 and then collected in Wells's short story collection The Country of the Blind and Other Stories in 1911. It belongs to his early phase, when during the 10 or so years following the publication of his first book, The Time Machine, in 1895 he produced the majority of his best work. The Country of the Blind is rich in symbolism, as perhaps any story based around blindness and sight is destined to be, especially in the hands of one of the pioneers of science fiction and what we would now call speculative fiction. So a few words of analysis may help to elucidate the story. Before that, however, you can read the story here. The Country of the Blind, summary. The story is about a mysterious valley in South America where a community grew up, separated from the rest of civilization. A disease struck the community which meant that people went blind, until each new generation was born completely sightless. A man from Ecuador, named Nunez, while acting as a mountain guide for some Englishmen, falls and ends up amongst this country of the blind. He has heard the legends about them, and regards the whole thing as an adventure. He recalls the old proverb, "In the country of the blind the one-eyed man is king," and thinks he will teach them about the world beyond their village. When he's taken to see their elders, however, he discovers that over the course of the 14 generations that their people had lived in this valley, they had developed their own world cut off from the rest of civilization. Their valley was the whole world to them, and birds in the sky were angels, with their gift of flight and their beautiful song. Instead of day and night, they divide the day up into warm and cold, because they cannot see the light, or dark but can sense the temperature of the land by day and night. Because they don't need to work by daylight, they sleep during the warm, i.e. daytime, and work during the cold, i.e. nighttime. Communication between Nunez and the blind is not perfect, and when they are trying to ascertain who he is, they misinterpret his responses and believe his name is Bogotá, whereas that is the place where he came from before his fall. The people of the country of the blind view Nunez as someone who has been created so that he might learn from them. Nunez, of course, has other ideas and wishes to teach and lord it over the blind. His speech is not as beautiful or as elegant as theirs. Their skill with language appears to have developed, presumably because speech was more important to them as they could not rely on visual cues or observing body language in conversation. Although Nunez believes he is a king among these people, he is a clumsy and useless stranger, whose sense of hearing and smell is nowhere near as good as it is among those he considers his royal subjects. They do not recognize such concepts as sight and blind. These words do not figure in their vocabulary. He seeks to amaze them with his knowledge of what the world looks like and the stars beyond, but they disbelieve him, arguing that the world ends at the edges of their own valley and that there is a roof of stone over the world instead of the sky. Becoming increasingly frustrated that his plan to become their king has not proved as easy to implement as he'd hoped, Nunez gets angry one day and picks up a spade, meaning to strike one of them down. He keeps repeating to himself, "In the country of the blind the one-eyed man is king." However, he finds that he cannot morally bring himself to hit a blind person in cold blood, and when head blind all gather against him, armed with their own spades, he runs away. However, he cannot survive for long on his own, without food, and so he ends up going back to them and submitting to them, apologizing for his former behavior and telling them what he knows they want to hear. That he was mistaken when he said he could see, and that there is a stone roof over the world, as they argue there is. Nunez becomes a citizen of the country of the blind, and is attracted to a young woman, Medina-sarate, who is unmarried because her face does not conform to the ideals of feminine beauty among the blind but very much appeals to Nunez, since she has long eyelashes and lacks the sunken eyes which the rest of the blind have in this world. The two of them fall in love, and Nunez ventures to tell her about the beauty of sight. She listens and appears to understand. However, Jakob, her father, forbids them to marry because he and the rest of the blind view Nunez as an idiot who has delusions. Jakob can see how much his daughter loves Nunez, however, so he speaks to one of the other elders, a doctor, who examines Nunez and says that the problem with Nunez's brain seems to stem from his eyes, which are unlike those of the blind. He proposes a surgical operation to remove Nunez's eyes so he will be cured and can then marry Medina-sarate. Nunez resists the proposal at first, but Medina-sarate tells him he should go through with it for her, so they will be allowed to be together. Although she seems to understand Nunez's gift of sight, she knows that her father will not allow them to marry unless her would-be husband is cured of his ability to see. He agrees to this reluctantly, but when the day arrives for the operation to be carried out, he finds he cannot go through with it, so much does his sight mean to him. So he leaves the village and begins the long climb up the mountains so that he might escape the country of the blind and get back to Bogota and civilization. The story ends with him lying, peacefully contented, under the stars when night comes. The Country of the Blind, analysis. Like all of Wells's best fiction, The Country of the Blind is packed full with symbolic meaning, but it's not easy to see what meaning or interpretation we are supposed to take from it. The story might be viewed as a warning about the dangers of colonialism, with Nunez thinking himself superior to the blind because he comes from mainstream civilization, and they do not have the same knowledge and view of the world as he does. Of course, if we analyze the story as a sort of allegory for imperialism, we would have no choice but to conclude that the story represents an example of tall poppy syndrome, where an arrogant person is cut down to size. Nunez ends the story by running away from the people he sought to colonize, so if this is what we view the story as representing, his imperial venture is a resounding failure. However, such a reading only goes so far, and it might be more productive to view The Country of the Blind as a story about the clash of the individual versus the collective. The shared perspective of the blind in the story is what allows their community to function. They are united by the fact that none of them is able to see, so that the very concept of sight has fallen out of their lexicon. When a man with the gift of sight shows up and wishes to teach them about their ignorance, they respond with hostility and disbelief. In their view, if view is quite the word, Nunez must adapt to their way of life or remain an outsider. In this respect, it perhaps makes more sense to read The Country of the Blind as a forerunner to the later 20th century dystopias of Orwell, Huxley, Bradbury, and others, in which the individual finds themselves at the mercy of the system. What adds credence to such an analysis is the fact that we as readers know that Nunez's view of the world is correct. There really is a world beyond their small valley, and there is a sky full of stars above them, not a stone roof that marks the limit of the world. But ignorance is hard to overcome when the knowledgeable number just one man and the ignorant are many. This is not to say, of course, that Nunez is right. From the outset, he views his arrival in their village as an adventure, and has delusions of becoming their king. In this respect, Jakob's use of that very word, delusions, to describe Nunez's beliefs is correct, not because Nunez is wrong about the world but because he has underestimated the power of the many against the few, however wrong the many are and regardless of how right the few may be. Like Winston Smith at the end of Orwell's 1984, Nunez must undergo his corrective treatment, in his case, the removal of his eyes. But his experience among the blind also affects his mind, too. He wasted for some days, and they nursed him kindly. That refined his submission, but they insisted on his lying in the dark, and that was a great misery. And blind philosophers came and talked to him of the wicked levity of his mind, and reproved him so impressively for his doubts about the lid of rock that covered their cosmic casserole that he almost doubted whether indeed he was not the victim of hallucination in not seeing it overhead. This is akin to what we might now call gaslighting, or psychological conditioning. The blind are so used to their own lack of sight, and so convinced that their visitor must be deluded in thinking the world different from the way they envision it, again, not the most apt word, that they feel that Nunez must be talked out of his wrong think, until he even starts to doubt the proof of his own eyes. In the last analysis, though, even this reading may fall short of encapsulating all that the story means, and all that it might mean to different readers. It is not an allegory, because blind and sight cannot be reduced to a simple x equals y equation in this story. It is, however, rich in symbolism however we might choose to see those symbols.
Okay.